welcome to the 11th episode of RNV Talks, in which we will be talking about many different aspects of the history and culture of the Roma minority. This podcast is released as part of the project EUROMIJA, implemented by the Roma National Council of Croatia in the framework of the European Solidarity Corps. Let's see what the team has in store for us today.
Today we're talking about a very interesting but lesser known topic, the origins of Roma in Georgia. It's also interesting that Georgia is actually one of the few countries where you can find all three main branches, the Rom, Dom and Lom people living together in the same borders.
Okay, but what about the numbers? Is there a big presence of Roma in Georgia?
Well, according to official statistics from 2023, there are only 604 Roma living in Georgia, but that number tells a very different story than what you actually see on the ground. NGO representatives working closely with these communities assume that unofficially the population could be as high as 3,000.
Whoa, a gap like that, from 600 to 3,000, usually points to a history of marginalization or lack of documentation.
Well, it could be a bit of both, rooted in a very long history of movement. To understand their place in Georgia, we have to go back to their very first steps. Most studies agree that the Roma initially originated in the northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent, and from there they began a centuries-long journey that branched out across the world.
Okay, so I've heard there are several theories about the paths they took to get here. It wasn't just one straight line, was it?
Exactly. There are three main routes that researchers discuss. Some theories suggest a southern route through what is now Iran. Others believe they took a northern path through Central Asia, and a third group of scholars indicates the possibility of a mixture of both routes. And the fact that we have all three branches here today, Rom, Dom and Lom, it's a major clue for historians trying to reconstruct those ancient migratory patterns.
Okay, but let's try to place this in the context of the big history, let's say. Georgia isn't just a pass-through country, it's an ancient land. We're talking about a history that goes back to the Proto-Georgian tribes like the Iberia, Diauchi, and Colchis confederations, which existed as far back as the end of the second millennium BCE. And what about the Roma? What do we know about their arrival?
While the history of Georgia saw the unification of the kingdom under Bagrat III in the 11th century, there is still no mention of the Roma in Georgia from that era.
But why wouldn't a historian mention them? I mean, where are the records?
There might be several explanations for that. Experts point to the ancient way of conducting ethnographic studies, which tended to ignore any ethnic groups that didn't have a specific homeland. And if you were in settled power with a king and a capital city, you often weren't deemed worthy of the state record. And on top of that, widespread illiteracy within the Roma communities meant that they didn't leave behind their own written accounts, making it even harder to define an accurate history.
Alright, so we have this, let's say, silent period from the 11th century, but Georgia was a crossroads of empires, the Mongols, the Persians, the Ottomans. Didn't that change the dynamic a little bit?
It did, but slowly. For centuries, western Georgia was dominated by the Ottomans, while the eastern region was under the Persian influence. And the evidence suggests that in those Ottoman-dominated areas, there was a subgroup called the Gurbeti, a branch of the Roma you can still find in the Southeast Europe today. But the real explosion in the population and also in the documentation happened when the Russian Empire took control of Georgia in the 19th century. And this was likely because the Russian Empire already had a massive Roma population, and the new political unification made movement into Georgia much easier.
And this brings us to the Lom people, right? In Georgia, you often hear the term Bosha used to describe them, but where do they fit in?
The Lom people, so Bosha, are actually among the groups connected to the Roma people that have been living in Georgia for the longest. And their story could be a positive example of integration into the local society. They have a historical presence primarily in Armenia, where they migrated around the 10th century. And because of that long history in Armenia, their arrival in Georgia is also tied to Armenian movements.
So was it a gradual movement across the border or a specific event?
It could have been a bit of both, but there was also an important moment during the Russo-Turkish War of 1828-29. The Russian Empire organized a mass resettlement of Armenians into the Javakheti region of Georgia, and many Lom people moved with them as part of that resettlement. This is actually one of the very first documented instances of a mass migration of Roma-related groups to Georgian territory.
And I assume that left a deep impact on their culture and language.
Absolutely. Because of those deep roots in Armenia, the Lom people in Georgia, and particularly in the southwest Georgia, speak the Western dialect of the Armenian language. And what's important is that this is a distinct from the Eastern dialect, which is the dominant language spoken in Armenia today.
But what about the 20th century? How did the Soviet era change those dynamics?
Well, after a brief period of independence, starting in 1918, Georgia was invaded by the Red Army and made part of the USSR in 1921. And paradoxically, Roma mobility actually increased in Soviet Georgia because they came here seeking for financial or physical security. Between 1930 and 1933, the Soviet Union suffered a horrific famine caused by Stalin's forced collectivization of agriculture, and areas like Ukraine were hit the hardest. Roma from those major grain-producing regions fled toward places with relative stability, and Georgia was also one of these destinations.
I've also heard you talk about the Crimean Roma before. Their story during this period sounds especially tragic.
It is definitely one of the most painful chapters in this history. The Crimean Roma, the Krimuria, lived on the Crimean Peninsula alongside the Tatars for centuries. Some say they arrived as early as the 15th century, while the others think they came from Bessarabia in the 19th century. Regardless, they adopted Islam and the Tatar language under that strong local influence.
And then the World War II happened.
Yes. During the Nazi occupation of Crimea between 1942 and 44, the Crimean Roma became victims of the Nazi policy of Roma genocide, and those who managed to escape death then found themselves targeted by the Soviet authorities, who accused them of aiding the Nazis.
So they were practically caught between two genocidal and repressive regimes. But where did the survivors go?
Some fled to Georgia to escape both the aftermath of the genocide and the ongoing Soviet purges. Today, their descendants form the Krimuria Roma group in western Georgia. And because they follow Islam and live in the West, they have very limited contact with the Vlachs branch of Roma, who live in the East and practice Christian Orthodoxy.
I find it quite incredible how these two groups, the Muslim Krimuria and the Orthodox Vlachs, can live in the same small country and yet be so separated by their respective histories. But where did the Vlachs come from?
The Vlachs, including the Kalderash subgroup, are thought to have arrived from Moldova. Their migration was similarly triggered by famines in the southern USSR and also the invasions of the World War II. So you have two different migrations from two different directions with two different religions all settling together in Georgia.
So we've covered the Rom and the Lom, but we haven't touched on the Dom people yet. They seem to be a much more recent part of the story.
Exactly, they are the post-Soviet chapter. The Dom people arrived in Georgia mostly from Azerbaijan after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. They identify as Azeri Kurds or Kurdish Dom, and they speak Kurmanji, which is the most widespread Kurdish dialect.
Wow, but do they still consider themselves part of the same community as the other Roma we've discussed?
Not really. The Dom people actually distance themselves from both other Kurds and the Roma. In turn, the Roma community doesn't consider Dom also to be part of their group, primarily because the languages are so different.
But what brought them here? Was it the same search for stability?
Here it's more about the cross-border labor mobility. They are part of a network that spans Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, and they actually consider the Turkish Domler to be part of their community, and they have been reestablishing links with them since the borders opened in 1991.
Okay, speaking of 1991, the collapse of the USSR was a massive upheaval for Georgia, I can imagine. But how did it affect the population that was already there?
The fall of the communist regime left many Roma unemployed, and the 1990s were marked by huge emigration waves. Most Roma migrated north to the Russian Federation looking for better economic opportunities.
And so do the numbers show that decline clearly?
They do. The number of self-declared Roma in Georgia dropped from 1,774 in 1989 to just 472 in 2002. And this wasn't just economic. The armed conflicts in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, combined with the rise of nationalist mobilization in the 90s and some other reasons, made many minority communities feel like they had to leave for their own safety or stability.
Okay, it seems like the story of the Roma in Georgia is kind of a cycle, arriving in search of stability during one crisis and then leaving during the next.
Yes, and throughout the centuries, these groups have moved to this region in search of security, financial stability, or simply as a part of their traditional lifestyle. Because so much of this history is unwritten, we have to rely on the analysis of living memory, the study of spoken language variations, and the few documented sources that...
We have to preserve this culture.
The study of spoken language variations and the few documented sources that we have.
So it's such a powerful reminder that history isn't just about the battles and the kingdoms and the empires. It's also about the people who were moving between them.
Exactly. Their origins might be unclear, but the presence of Roma is an important part of the Georgian tapestry. That was it for today. Thank you for listening and see you next time.